G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the book of Ezekiel. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. So we're into session 6 of the book of Ezekiel. We're going to try and cover chapter 7, verse 14 to chapter 8, verse 18 in this session. Now, we're into in the part of the book where we're looking at the end of Judah, which is about to come about. We see also this is in the section of the prophecies of the fall of Jerusalem. Now, in verses 14 to 22, we see the wrath and the sword of God. This is a section on that. Now, the wrath and the sword is touching the people and the land. But in particular, this is from verses 14 to 22, but in particular, the temple. Now, in verse 14, we have the wrath. They have blown the trumpet. The blowing of the trumpet was for what? It was to warn of the enemy's approach. It was also to call the army to begin making preparations for battle. And it says, and have made ready. So they've blown the trumpet and have made ready. They've all mobilized the army and they equipped themselves with weapons. But when it comes to actually getting involved in the fighting, it says, none goeth to battle. None of them go to battle. Why? The reason is because it says God's wrath is upon all the multitude. And so a cowardly fear probably holds them from the battle. And no one goes out to challenge the invading army. And indeed, when the Babylonians, when they invaded the land for the third time, which is in 586 BC, because of Zedekiah's rebellion, there was not a lot of opposition until they arrived outside the gates of Jerusalem. Now, the sword is in verse 15. The sword is without, meaning the besieging army is now outside the city walls of Jerusalem. Remember, we're talking about Judah here, the southern kingdom. And this is with Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon coming to put an end to them. Now, it says the sword is without, meaning the besieging army is now outside the city walls, and then within or inside the city is the pestilence and the famine. He that is in the field, which is outside the city, shall die with the sword. He that is in the city, famine and pestilence shall devour him. So those who happen to be caught out in their fields are killed by the sword of the Babylonians, while those who are locked up inside the city will die of famine and pestilence. Remember, this is God's judgment upon Judah because of their sin and their idolatry. Now, as for the surviving remnant, remember last session we saw there was going to be a surviving remnant. As for the surviving remnant in verse 16, some of them are going to escape. But those of them that escape shall escape. Now, what Ezekiel said back in chapter 6, he reiterates here again, they will be on the mountains like the doves of the valleys, all of them moaning, as they realize what? As they realize that the gods upon whom they have called have proved to be utterly useless. Every one will be there moaning atop the mountains in his iniquity. And then in verses 17 to 19, he describes the three key effects of this judgment upon the people. First of all, in verse 17, we're going to see weakness or cowardliness. It says, all hands shall be feeble and all knees shall be weak. And secondly, in verse 18 of chapter 7, we're going to see them mourning. They shall also gird themselves with sackcloth, and horror shall cover them, and shame shall be upon all faces, and baldness upon all their heads. Now, all of these things here, like sackcloth, shame on their faces, baldness upon their heads, and so on, these are all symbols and signs of mourning. There should be the inward feelings of horror and shame, and then their outward symbols would be the sackcloth and the shaving of head, that sort of stuff. Now, what's sackcloth? Sackcloth was it was a very coarse cloth woven from the long hair of goats or camels. And because of its dark color, sackcloth was considered appropriate for serious, somber occasions. So putting on sackcloth, you're in mourning. And thirdly, we see in verse 19 of chapter 7, their wealth of silver and gold which they had been hoarding. We're going to see what happens to that. First, we're going to see here, it says, they shall cast their silver in the streets, and their gold shall be as an unclean thing. Their silver and their gold should not be able to deliver them in the day of the wrath of Jehovah. They shall not satisfy their souls, neither fill their bowels, because it has been the stumbling block of their iniquity. Now, what's he all talking about here? Well, the Hebrew word for unclean thing, it says here, their gold shall be as an unclean thing. It's a special word here which refers to sexual impurity. And one example of this, you can find this in Leviticus chapter 20, verse 21. Leviticus 20, verse 21. Now, why would the people suddenly loathe their material wealth? You know, they've hoarded up all this gold and silver. Why are they going to loathe it? Well, one of the reasons was the inability of this silver and gold to buy the security for which it was originally collected or amassed. Neither their silver nor their gold will be able to deliver them or buy them food. It'll become useless and only thrown out into the street as so much rubbish. Imagine that. Their wealth will not satisfy their souls, neither fill their bowels. They'll not be able to buy food with it because there is no food. Remember, inside the city, going to be dying by famine. And neither will they be able to secure their own personal deliverances with it. Why? Because the Babylonians will not be bribed and bought off as they had been on the previous 2 times. Nebuchadnezzar has had enough of them. Yeah, their silver and gold was the stumbling block of their iniquity. Why? Because they use it to make their own household images and idols. And Jeremiah, that's the other prophet, other contemporary prophet, who Jeremiah is still back in Jerusalem, he heavily emphasized this. So because their silver and their gold was wrongfully used, in that sense, it became the stumbling block of their iniquity, and now it has brought on this judgment. Now, in verses 20 to 22, we see the effects upon the temple. As for the beauty of his ornament, he set it in majesty. But they made the images of their abominations and their detestable things therein. Therefore have I made it unto them as an unclean thing. And I'll give it into the hands of the strangers for a prey, and to the wicked of the earth for a spoil, and they shall profane it. My face will I turn also from them, and they shall profane my secret place. And robbers shall enter into it and profane it. So, what's Ezekiel talking about here? Well, Ezekiel is now describing in verses 20 to 22, chapter 7, he's now describing the effects of the judgment upon the Jewish temple. Verse 20 tells what the temple was and what it then became. Originally, the temple, it was what God had made. It was what God had made of it. It was, as for the beauty of his ornament, he set in majesty. That's describing the temple. That's what God considered the temple to be. Jerusalem, with its surrounding hills, was like an ornament, with the temple set in the midst of her like a special jewel. And this is something Ezekiel is going to repeat later on in chapter 24, verse 21, and chapter 24, verse 25. It was the joy of their glory. It was the desire of their eyes. That's what the temple in Jerusalem was. God had set the temple in majesty. He made the temple his special jewel. But what did Israel do with it? What did they do with it? What did they do with it? They made images of their abominations. And that was within the temple compound. They put their detestable things therein. So, as a reaction to what Israel did, God did something as well. Therefore, so in response to what Israel did, now God turned it into an unclean thing. Many Israelites placed their hope of deliverance on God's temple in Jerusalem. Remember, they thought that surely he would not let his holy temple be destroyed. A reference to that is, if you ever look at Jeremiah chapter 7, verses 1 to 5, Jeremiah 7, 1 to 5. It's the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. Remember, they were shouting, oh, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. No, we'll be safe here because the temple of the Lord is still standing. But Israel's sin was so serious that not even the temple would escape God's judgment. Now, Micah 3:12 tells us that, actually. Micah 3:12. And there in verse 21, and I will give it into the hands of the strangers for a prey, and to the wicked of the earth for a spoil, and they shall profane it. So the temple, which had been a jewel, now became an unclean thing, and so it has to be given up. God will turn it over into the hands of strangers. In verse 21, the wicked of the earth will take hold of it as spoil. So the Gentiles from Babylon are going to profane it. They're going to profane it, make it unclean. And then in verse 22, the temple is to be profaned. My face will I turn also from them. So as God turns his face away from that which was once his ornament and jewel which was set in majesty, the enemy will be allowed to take it. And in so doing, they shall profane my secret place, and robbers shall enter into it. Now, the robbers are entering in not to worship, but to profane it and seek the wealth that is in it and to plunder it. This is what the Babylonians did. So the turning away of God's face in verse 22, which allows the temple to be destroyed, which we're going to see more about this in chapters 8 to 11. Ezekiel, in chapters 8 to 11, Ezekiel's going to go into a pretty long and detailed explanation of the whys and hows and the wherefores of the departure of the Shekinah glory, the manifold presence of God. Chapters 8 to 11 will elaborate upon this verse 22 here, the turning away of God's face that permits the temple to be now destroyed. And we see the chain of captivity in verses 23 to 27. Now, as Ezekiel begins to deal with this chain, he emphasizes the coming captivity. And in verse 23, he brings an indictment. Make the chain, for the land is full of bloody crimes, and the city is full of violence. So it has two elements to it. First, the land in general is full of bloody crimes. And second, the city of Jerusalem in particular is full of violence. And because of these things, the chain of captivity has been forged. And he goes on to say in verse 23, wherefore? Wherefore? Well, because of what's been happening in verse 23, the judgment now comes in verse 24. God is going to bring the worst of the nations against Israel. And that is how God describes the Babylonians, as the worst of the nations. They're going to invade the land and they shall possess their houses. That means take the possession of the houses of Israel. I'll also make the pride of the strong to cease, that in which the strong in Israel have taken pride. And the holy places of their idolatrous centers will be profaned. So Babylon is going to come in and rip it apart. And then in verse 25, this is going to be followed by the loss of all hope. Destruction cometh, and they shall seek peace, and there shall be none. The destruction here is certain. And when it comes, they're going to be looking for peace, but they're not going to find it. In turn, this will lead to confusion in verse 26. Mischief upon mischief, rumor upon rumor. It was just so many rumors and so much things going on that no one knows what to believe anymore. So no sooner would one catastrophe be reported than word would come of another. Rumors spread through Jerusalem of alliances and deliverers and coups and reversals in Babylon, and each piece of gossip was eagerly received by a terrified people. You know, in addition to listening to the many false rumors racing through the city, it goes on to say, and they shall seek a vision of the prophet, for the law shall perish from the priest and counsel from the elders. So the people in their desperation are going to seek also out the prophet, the priest, and the elders to gain insight from God. But this would be in vain. They'd refused to heed the warnings from God's true spokesman. So when they would desperately seek an answer in verses 26 and 27, none would be available. Their rulers will prove themselves to be impotent. Ezekiel enumerates them. First of all, the prophets. They shall seek a vision of the prophet. Now, this, of course, means the false prophet here. But there won't be any vision. Micah prophesied exactly the same thing in Micah chapter 3, verses 5 to 7. Second, as for the priest, the law shall perish from the priest. Now, remember, the priest was supposed to expound the law, but now he'll no longer be able to explain it or expound upon it. That was one of the key principles or the key functions of the Jewish priesthood. So beyond taking care of the temple and sacrificing, the special function of the tribe of Levi was to teach the scriptures to the other 11 tribes. But now, at this point in time, they're going to lose the ability to do that as well. The Jewish leaders back in Jerusalem were actually still denying that any of this would ever happen. In Jeremiah 18, verse 8, the rulers were saying before the fall of the city, the law shall not perish from the priest. But Ezekiel counteracts this in this passage. He says, no, he says the law's going to depart from the priest. They won't even be able to explain it anymore. And the third group he remarks upon are the elders. Counsel will perish from the elders. None of them will be able to give any advice that's going to prove useful or helpful. And in verse 27, it says, the king shall mourn, and the prince shall be clothed with desolation, and the hands of the people of the land shall be troubled. I will do unto them after their way, and according to their deserts will I judge them, and they shall know that I am Jehovah. So, as for the king, fourth thing Ezekiel points out here, as for the king, all he could do was mourn. Now, Zedekiah was a very weak king and had nothing of his own to add to the situation. However, just something here. The prince, let's look at the prince. The prince shall be clothed with desolation as a result of failure among these 5 different types of leaders. The hands of the people shall be troubled when they seek for guidance and help. They'll receive none. Now, see here we have a king and a prince, right? Ezekiel generally used the word prince to refer to Zedekiah. We're going to see it a little bit later on in chapter 12, verse 10, 12:10, 12:12, and 21:25. Ezekiel never gave Zedekiah the title of king. The only Israelite in Ezekiel's book, Ezekiel called king, was Jehoiakim. But remember, right back in chapter 1, verse 2, he went into captivity in Babylon. So he was the real king in the land, but he got taken away. And King Jehoiakim was already in captivity, mourning Jerusalem's certain fall, while Prince Zedekiah, right, he was the one who was currently ruling over Judah. He was in Jerusalem in despair over his plight. So as a result, the people were trembling in fear at their uncertain fate. They didn't know what was going to happen. If they listened to Jeremiah, they would know what was going to happen. Now, this section ends in the second part of verse 27 with God's purpose. The basis of the judgment, once again, is, I will do unto them after their way, and according to their deserts will I judge them. In other words, God's fit his punishment to their sin. Now, the end result will be that they do recognize that Jehovah alone is God. Because remember, they were steeped in idolatry here. Now, we're coming to that section from chapter 8, verse 1 down to chapter 11, verse 25, where we're going to look at the departure of the Shekinah glory. And this is from the temple. With chapter 7, we have the end of the first series of prophecies, which began back in chapter 3, verse 22. And the time span of this first series covers a period of a little bit over 1 year. Next section is a very interesting one. Why? Because of what Ezekiel is going to say about the Shekinah glory. its departure from the temple, and the causes of it, and its consequences. Now, we're now in the second of the 5 main divisions of the book of Ezekiel, comprising this long section from chapter 3, verse 22 to the end of chapter 24. And this is dealing with Ezekiel's prophecies concerning the fall of Judah. He's saying all this between the second and third Babylonian deportations of Jews from the land, and announcing what is about to happen in the year 586 BC. 586 BC is the third deportation. 597 was the second. 604 was the first. Now, within this section, we're going to have several prophecies, of which we have concluded the first, which we've just done, which comprise chapter 3, 22 to the end of chapter 7. We've just knocked that one off. And that's concerning the fall of Jerusalem. Now we come to the second series of prophecies, which deal with this amazing departure of the Shekinah glory in chapters 8 to 11. And this section, we're going to break it down into 4 smaller units. Now, the vision recording in chapters 8 to 11 is a single unit, okay? But we're going to have 4 sections within it. Ezekiel was first confronted with the glory of Jehovah and the abominations of Jerusalem. And we're going to see the wickedness of the people in the temple in chapter 8. Then he was shown the slaughter of the people of Jerusalem in chapter 9. And Jerusalem was so wicked that God's glory now departed from the temple in chapter 10. And as it left the city, judgment was now pronounced on her rulers in chapter 11. So that's pretty much the breakdown of the departure of the Shekinah glory. Okay. We see the glory of Jehovah in chapter 8, verses 1 to 4. This is here we have the reappearance again of the Shekinah glory to Ezekiel in verses 1 to 4. But this time, it's to show him its departure. Ezekiel had repeatedly stated that the coming judgment was prompted by the people's sins. But what had the people of Jerusalem done to deserve such punishment? God took Ezekiel back to Jerusalem in a vision to show him the wickedness there. And this is what we're going to see in chapters 8 to 11. Now, verse 1 of chapter 8 provides the occasion of the reappearance of the Shekinah glory to Ezekiel. And it came to pass in the 6th year, in the 7th month, in the 5th day of the month, as I sat in my house, and the elders of Judah sat before me, the hand of the Lord Jehovah fell there upon me. So he gives us a date. It's the 6th year, which makes it 592 BC. The 6th month is August, September, somewhere around there. The 5th day makes it September the 17th, 592 BC. So between the time when Ezekiel was told to begin prophesying his first series of prophecies and this event was a period of 1 year and 2 months since the call. During that time, God was silent. And remember, when God is silent, it meant that Ezekiel had to be silent or mute and dumb in a ritual way. Remember, he was only permitted to speak when God spoke. So again, when he's speaking, it means that God is speaking. When he's silent, God has nothing to say. This is the way it's going to be for the first 7.5 years of Ezekiel's prophetic ministry, until he hears the report that Jerusalem has fallen. It has been 1 year and 2 months, which makes it now 420 days. Remember, he was told to lie on one side or the other for a total of 430 days, 390 days on one side, 40 days on the other side. So this reappearance here of the Shekinah glory comes to him during the last 10 days in which he's lying on his left side. Although he will continue to lie there in exile in Babylonia, in vision, he's going to be transported to the city of Jerusalem and right into the temple compound itself. So he has fulfilled 30 of the 40 days required for lying on his left side. And now he's going to be transported in vision. Now, those sitting in front of him are the elders of Judah. These are the ones in exile, which distinguishes them from the elders of the Jews in Jerusalem, will be dealt with a little bit later. It's clear here that the symbolic actions he was asked by God to perform in chapters 4 and 5 did actually attract the attention or the necessary attention because the elders are in front of him. Remember, he was told to perform 4 symbolic acts, all in view of the people. And at the same time, he came out with certain prophetic utterances, which were very disturbing to the exiles, because all the exiles were hoping to return to Jerusalem sooner rather than later. Remember that the false prophets in Jerusalem were saying, no, you're going to be back here in a couple of years. Don't worry about it. And Jeremiah is saying, no, you won't. However, Ezekiel prophesied the opposite. They're not going to be back there shortly. Jerusalem was destined for destruction. So he has created enough attention now so that he can keep his ministry close to home, as he was instructed to do. Now, the elders of Judah in exile have gathered at his house to listen to what he has to say on the strength of the first series of messages which we had looked at back in chapters 3 to chapter 7. They'd probably gone to seek his advice, possibly on the fate of Jerusalem. Now, the vision here was God's answer, which Ezekiel then reported to them, which we're going to see down in chapter 11, verses 24 to 25. So at this particular point in time, the Shekinah glory suddenly appears in verse 2 in the same form which we saw in chapter 1. Verse 2, then I beheld, and lo, a likeness as the appearance of fire, from the appearance of his loins and downward fire, from his loins and upward as the appearance of brightness, as it were glowing metal. So we have a likeness as the appearance of fire and the brightness of glowing metal. And since we already covered this in the first chapter, we don't have to go over all this again. Just to say to you that these 3 elements of fire, brightness, and glowing metal, these are symbols of the Shekinah glory. Remember what the Shekinah glory is? Shekinah glory is the visible manifestation of God's presence. When God takes on a visible form and appears to men, this is his Shekinah. Over and over again, the root shakan is used, and Shekinah is simply the English rendering of Shekinah. Literally, it means it's the dwelling or the dwelling place. So therefore, the Shekinah refers to the visible presence of God, manifestation of the visible presence of God. Now, this is the 3rd time Ezekiel sees the Shekinah glory, and he recognizes it as the same thing he had seen back in chapter 1, verse 26 to 27. Same description. And in verse 3, it says, he put forth the form of a hand and took me, this is the Shekinah glory, and took me by the lock of my head, and the Spirit lifted me up between earth and heaven, and brought me in the visions of God to Jerusalem, to the door of the gate of the inner court that looked toward the north, where was the seat of the image of jealousy, which provoked to jealousy. Okay, so in verse 3, Ezekiel is transported in this vision. He's not taken physically to Jerusalem, because physically he still has to lay on his side in Babylonia for the next 10 days. But in vision, he's going to be transported to Jerusalem so that he can actually see things that are going on there, and things that are happening there, and things that will happen there. So, as we saw back in chapter 2, verse 9, out of the Shekinah glory, the form of a hand, it comes and takes him by a lock of his hair. This is the only place in Scripture where anything like this is mentioned. Hebrew word for lock is the word zitzis, and normally refers to the fringes on the borders of a garment which the Jews had to wear according to Mosaic law. Orthodox Jews still wear them today. Now here, the word is used and refers to the hair growing on the front sides of his head. So remember, he was told to shave his head completely in one of his symbolic actions. So the hair at his temples would now have been long enough by now so it could be grafted hold of in the way he describes here. And this word here is normally used this word we see here is normally used for the borders of a garment. And you can have a look at that if you want to have a look in Numbers 15, verses 38 to 39. Numbers 15, 38 to 39. So in this vision, the Spirit, in vision, remember it's in vision, the Spirit suddenly picks him up by the hair, and he sees himself dangling between heaven and earth. And this is the unique way in which the Holy Spirit inspired the prophet for the vision he's about to see. Again, notice this is not a physical transportation, but something which happened in the visions of God where he was brought to Jerusalem. So the elders seated before him didn't see the theophany of God. As the vision passed from Ezekiel, which we're going to see later on in Ezekiel 11, verse 24, he described it to the elders when we get to chapter 11. Now, the specific place that he's brought to is the gate to the inner court that looked toward the north, or more simply, to the north gate of the inner court wall. Ezekiel finds himself standing in the outer court in front of the gate that leads to the inner court of the northern gate. I've given you, there's shortly you'll see an image, which I'll put in the PowerPoints as well. So what he sees there is the seat of the image of jealousy. So most likely what this would have been a statue of the goddess Asherah, right, which was placed there by the various kings of Judah, the most significant of whom was a king called Manasseh. Manasseh in 2 Kings 21, verse 7. It says that this image provoked to jealousy. So this image calls for a visitation in wrath of the jealous God who will not give his honor to another. You can have a look at Exodus 20, verse 5, where it speaks about a jealous God and a jealous God here. Okay. Now, in Ezekiel 20, verses 4 to 6, God warns that Israel's idolatrous worship of other gods would provoke him to jealousy. Now, we tend to think of jealousy only in the negative sense. But the Old Testament Hebrew, which is a word called kinah, or it could be Q-I-N-A-H or K-I-N-A-H, for jealousy, is used in three different senses. One is that of envy, and this is always in a bad sense. You know, don't be envious, don't covet. A second meaning is zeal, used in both a good and a bad sense in the Old Testament. It's used both of man and of God, but of God only in its good sense. Third meaning is jealousy, and it is used in both a good and bad sense of both man and God in the Old Testament. In its good sense, jealousy simply means the right to claim possession. Because Israel is the wife of Jehovah, something Ezekiel will deal with later on in chapter 16, Israel's worship of other gods is looked upon by God as spiritual adultery, and therefore it provokes his jealousy. And that's in the sense that he has the right to claim possession of his wife Israel. Therefore, this image that is placed there, this Asherah, is an outrage to God and provokes him to vindicate his exclusive right to his wife. Now, in verse 4, further identification is made that this is the Shekinah glory of the God of Israel. And behold, the glory of the God of Israel was there, according to the appearance that I saw in the plain. Now, Ezekiel clearly states that this was exactly the same thing he had seen in the plain back in chapter 3, verses 22 to 23. Back in that passage, it says, "And the hand of Jehovah was there upon me, and he said unto me, Arise, go forth into the plain, and I will there talk with thee. Then I arose and went forth into the plain, and behold, the glory of Jehovah stood there as the glory which I saw by the river Kebar, and I fell on my face." So, with this transportation aspect of the vision over with, Ezekiel is now shown the abominations of Jerusalem. And this we're going to see in verses 5 to 18. Ezekiel is going to be shown various abominations here. And the purpose of being shown them is so that he will clearly understand exactly why the Shekinah glory must now depart from Israel. Shekinah glory came to live among the people of Israel when the tabernacle was finished in Exodus 40. And from that moment on until this particular time in Ezekiel, the Shekinah glory dwelt in the Holy of Holies. First, the Shekinah was in the tabernacle. Later on, it transferred itself to the temple, Solomon's temple, although at one point we see, as in 1 Samuel chapter 4, 1 Samuel 4, there was a fear that when the Philistines had captured the Ark of the Covenant, the Jews had lost the Shekinah glory, resulting in a woman naming her son Ichabod. Ichabod, what does that mean? It means the glory has departed. That's what they thought when the Ark of the Covenant was captured. They thought the glory was with the Ark of the Covenant, but it wasn't. That was wrong. The glory had not yet departed, but now the Shekinah glory will truly depart, and the reason for it is that these abominations which were occurring right inside the temple compound itself. It's bad enough that there were idols and abominations on every high hill and on every green tree throughout the land, but to bring them right into the very temple compound itself in 4 different forms that we're going to see was really the last straw. God had now had enough. And we see in verses 5 to 6 the image of jealousy. Verse 5 of chapter 8 emphasizes the sin itself. Then said he unto me, Son of man, lift up thine eyes now the way toward the north. So I lifted up mine eyes the way toward the north, and behold, northward of the gate of the altar, this image of jealousy in the entry. So Ezekiel is told to look toward the north. The northern gate was also known as the gate of the altar, because it was through this northern gate that animals were brought in for sacrifice on the altar. You can check that out in Leviticus 1:11 if you like. So the north gate and the gate of the altar, same gate. At this gate, where the proper sacrifices should have been brought in for approved sacrifice on the altar of sacrifice, what Ezekiel sees instead is an image of jealousy. So this means that the image itself was in the outer court in front of the north gate, or the gate of the altar, which now led into the inner court. So God was being provoked to jealousy because of a foreign god was receiving the worship that should have been his alone. The god or goddess represented by this idol is not named, but it may have been Asherah, the Canaanite goddess of fertility. As I said, King Manasseh, he placed a carved image of Asherah in the temple during his reign, back in 2 Kings 21 verse 7, 2 Kings 21:7. But later on, he removed it in 2 Chronicles 33:13 and 15. 2 Chronicles 33:13 and 15. Okay, so we see that the image of jealousy is there. Now, what's the declaration? This is the declaration here. And he said unto me, Son of man, seest thou what they do? Even the great abominations that the house of Israel do commit here, that I should go far off from my sanctuary. But thou shalt again see yet other great abominations. So in verse 6, Ezekiel is asked, do you see what they do? Can you see what great abominations Israel is committing right here in God's own temple compound? And what is it that they are provoking God to do? The verse says that I should go far off from my sanctuary. So here, Ezekiel is giving the first hint of what he's about to see, the Shekinah glory departing from the sanctuary. So this idol then is the first thing that provokes God to leave. But as bad as this is, Ezekiel is told that he'll see worse than this yet. So with that transition, there comes a second great problem in verses 7 to 13, where the next thing he sees is the worship of the Egyptian gods. In verse 7, and he brought me to the door of the court, and when I looked, behold, a hole in the wall. So now he's transported to the door of the court. He sees a little hole in the wall. In verse 8, then said he unto me, Son of man, dig now in the wall. And when I had digged in the wall, behold, a door. So he's told to dig away, enlarge it. As he continues to make it bigger, suddenly he exposes a door. So in his vision, in verse 9, and he said unto me, go in and see the wicked abominations that they do here. So he's instructed to go through this door in order to see what greater abominations are now going on right within the temple compound. And verse 10, so I went in and saw, and behold, every form of creeping things and abominable beasts, and all the idols of the house of Israel portrayed upon the wall round about. So what he saw were basically Egyptian deities. Egyptians worshipped the creepers. This kind of worship was forbidden in Leviticus chapter 11, verses 1 to 47. So Leviticus 11, 1 to 47. So not only were there idols of these things, they were also portrayed all around the walls. Ezekiel does not use the ordinary word for idol here, but one that means pellets of dung, and he uses this several times before. Excrement. That reflects what he thinks about these idols. And then in verse 11, we're told who the worshippers are. And there stood before them 70 men of the elders of the house of Israel. So these were the leaders of the laity, the civil leaders. Obviously, they were not the elders who were seated in front of Ezekiel in Babylon in verse 1. These were the elders who had emerged among the people left in Jerusalem after the second deportation. And standing right in the midst of them stood Jezaniah, the son of Shaphan. Now, among them, this man, Jezaniah, apparently, he was acting as their leader. The significant thing about him is whose son he is. His father was a man named Shaphan, who had been a very faithful scribe to King Josiah, good King Josiah. He's mentioned in 2 Kings 22, verse 3, and Jeremiah 29, verse 3, Jeremiah 29:3 and Jeremiah 36:10 and 39:14. Shaphan had a number of sons, 3 of whom we read about back in Jeremiah, who were faithful like their father was. However, there were among the very few people who were pro-Jeremiah at that time. They helped Jeremiah. They looked after Jeremiah as best as they could. But Jezaniah, a 4th son, he was the one black sheep in the family. He went contrary to his father and 3 brothers. Here, he's acting as leader of the 70 lay elders who were secretly worshipping idols right within the temple compound. At the end of verse 11, their act of worship was the offering of incense. Every man with his censer in his hand, and the odor of the cloud of incense went up. Now, remember, within the temple building itself, there were 2 rooms, the holy place and the holy of holies, which are separated by a thick curtain. So they're offering incense there. And then in verse 12 to 13, then said he unto me, this is a declaration, Son of man, hast thou seen what the elders of the house of Israel do in the dark, every man in his chambers of imagery? For they say, Jehovah seeth us not. Jehovah has forsaken the land. He said also unto me, thou shalt again see yet other great abominations which they do. So in verse 12, God asked Ezekiel another question. Do you see what these elders of Israel are doing in the dark? Every man in his chamber of imagery. This means that all of these 70 lay leaders, each of them had a private chamber in the temple where he participated in the worship of these Egyptian gods. And why do you think they can get away with it? Well, because it says in verse 12, they say Jehovah, Israel's God, can't see them. Israel's God has forsaken the land, they say. They thought he had gone and couldn't see what they were doing. And with that comes another transitional statement in verse 13. Thou shalt again see yet other great abominations which they do. Virtually, God is saying to Ezekiel, you think this is bad? You wait till you see what happens next. That's what he's saying. And now we have the worship of Tammuz in verses 14 to 15. This is the third aspect of their idolatrous worship. Then he brought me to the door of the gate of Jehovah's house, which was toward the north. And behold, there sat the women weeping for Tammuz. Then said he unto me, Hast thou seen this, O son of man? Thou shalt again see yet greater abominations than these. Man, it just goes from worse to worse. In verse 14, once again, he sees himself transported in vision. And this time he's brought to the door of the gate of Jehovah's house, which is toward the north. He's in the inner court once again. And the sin he sees this time is Jewish women worshipping in the act of weeping for Tammuz. Now, this is the only time in the Old Testament that Tammuz is mentioned, although he's well known in ancient literature. It would occur in the 4th month of the Hebrew calendar. Now, the worship of Tammuz was nature worship. Yeah. Among the Sumerians and Babylonians, he was known as Dumazi, and was the beloved of Ishtar. So that's Dumazi, that's the Babylonians and Sumerians. He's also the Akkadian Duzu, and among the Greeks, he's known as Adonis. So he's a god of the new spring vegetation. So he is the dying and rising god. The mythological picture is of him dying in the winter and rising again in the spring. So this religion had a very strong appeal for women who spent their winter months crying for him. And this worship of Tammuz included acts of sexual immorality, practice in cultic prostitution. So each of these abominations appears to be getting progressively worse. And then in verse 15, we get another transitional question asked again. Hast thou seen this, O son of man? Now the worst comes in verse 16. We're going to see the worship of the sun in verse 16. And he brought me into the inner court of Jehovah's house, and behold, at the door of the temple of Jehovah, between the porch and the altar, were about 25 men, with their backs toward the temple of Jehovah and their faces toward the east. And they were worshiping the sun toward the east. In verse 16, Ezekiel is once again transported, and this time it is into the inner court of Jehovah's house. This is a section where only the priests were allowed to go. And since Ezekiel was a priest, he could go in there. He has been brought round about from the northern gate, which he was looking at from a position in the outer court, and into the inner court, and now over towards the east side. Here's a little illustration map here of this. You see the north gate and the east gate. Now, the way the temple was constructed, if you're looking out of the door of the temple itself, you'd be facing east. So as you entered into the holy place and the Holy of Holies, you'd be facing west, okay? So you go in through the east gate, you're now facing west. This was in contradistinction to the way pagan temples were built. They worshipped the sun, so they built their temples facing east. So you'd enter through the west gate. So the unique thing about the temple of Jehovah was that it faced west in the opposite direction. So imagine they're now facing the sun, okay? 25 men are sitting outside there in the court, facing the sun, worshiping the sun. So Ezekiel is now standing in front of the temple itself, between the temple porch and the altar. And suddenly he sees what their sin is. Unlike the previous group of 70 men who represented the Jewish laity, these 25 men represent the priesthood. Well, why do we say that? Well, because they were in the inner court, where only the priests were allowed to go. King David, when he set things up, he set the priesthood up into 24 courses, which he divided the tribe of Levi. 1 Chronicles 24. 1 Chronicles 24, you can find that. So each course would then have their turn for a 2-week period in which they could handle the affairs of all the temple work. Each of these 24 courses had a leader. So what this may mean is that we have 24 men who are acting as leaders of their courses, plus one who was acting as who was the high priest. What were they doing? Well, where were they facing west and worshiping the God of Israel in the Holy of Holies? No. Where were they facing? They had their backs to the temple of Jehovah, and they're facing toward the east. They were facing away from the place of his Shekinah and toward the direction of the sunrise. They had turned their backs upon God and were worshiping the sun. They were showing God their backsides. Now, this was forbidden in Deuteronomy 4:19. What made this sin perhaps the worst of all was the fact that these men were of the priesthood, standing in God's own temple and worshiping the sun. And then we see here verse 17. Then he said unto me, have you seen this, O son of man? Is it a light thing to the house of Judah that they commit the abominations which they commit here? For they have filled the land with violence and have turned again to provoke me to anger, and lo, they put the branch to their nose. So now in verse 17, the emphasis once again is on their sin. The house of Judah thought nothing of committing these acts of idolatry right here in the temple compound itself. But that's not all they're guilty of, because he goes on to say that the worship of God had deteriorated, and this in turn led on to something else. The land is filled with violence. God has been provoked to anger, and their final act is very interesting. They put the branch to their nose. Now, what's all that about? Well, this was reckoned to be an insulting gesture. That's why the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, translates this phrase simply as mockers. They were mocking God by doing this. Putting a branch to the nose was also a ritual of the Magi, who were Eastern astrologers. It was reckoned to be an obscene gesture and consequently very insulting. And the point here is that in these things, it was reckoned as an obscene gesture towards God himself. Therefore will I, verse 18, therefore will I also deal in wrath. Mine eye shall not spare, neither will I have pity. And though they cry in mine ears with a loud voice, yet will I not hear them. So in verse 18, the punishment will come because of what we have seen in verse 17. God will also deal in wrath in verse 18. There will be judgment without mercy. His eye will not spare, and he'll have no pity whatsoever. Although they'll begin crying to him with a loud voice, once the judgment hits, yet at that point, God will refuse to listen to them. And that's where we're going to leave Ezekiel and the idol worshippers in the temple compound. Thanks for coming along. Study hard, grow strong, and we'll see you next week for the next session. Thank you.